Oda needs to make Luffy suffer again. He's having too much fun. He's not taking anything seriously. So I read that Reddit thread title and I said to myself, this person is 1,100 more chapters into One Piece and seems to have missed the entire point of the series. But they're also not entirely wrong. In a post-Gear 5th world, One Piece now exists in a very weird space. This is very new territory for shonen manga, and it's actually going against many of the rules and principles that Eiichiro Oda established for himself when he began One Piece. So I'm going to tell you what those rules are, as well as why Oda broke them, the issues that the breaking of these rules causes, and why we are never returning to the way that One Piece once was, and whether that is a good or a bad thing, or a mix of both. So in the early days, Oda was almost laser focused on the concept of hardship. And this is because he knew that at the very dawn of One Piece, the romance dawn, his characters had big dreams. And in order to make these big dreams worth achieving, he needed big obstacles, both physical and mental. In a 2012 interview, Eiichiro Oda stated, "When Ace first appeared, the reaction from my audience was tremendous, so I worried about whether or not I should kill Ace. I had planned to kill him just 1 year after his appearance, but it ended up taking 10 years. So the reason why Ace was created at all was, to put it bluntly, to make Luffy suffer. Oda stated that Luffy needed to experience intense hardship if he wanted to pursue his dream beyond the red line. And on October 2nd of the year 2000, in chapter 154, Port Ghasty Ace appeared in the story for the ultimate purpose of dying for the sake of Luffy's character growth. Although we should note that he almost wasn't Port Ghasty Ace, as revealed in One Piece Green Secret Pieces, his original name was Port Ghasty Lang. And I imagine that's because you cannot waste a name as cool as Ace on a dude that's only going to be in the series for a single year. But Ace's death was extremely controversial, even before it actually happened. The editor during the Paramount War saga happened to be Hattori, and he vehemently tried to stop Oda from killing Ace, and he wasn't the only one either. During the Impel Down and Marineford arc specifically, Eiichiro Oda's office received a gargantuan amount of fan mail from readers begging Oda to save Ace's life. And I can't imagine how hard it must have been to follow through with the plan, when you've got both your editor and your readers desperately trying to stop you from doing so. And also the popularity of the character, that bleeds into other things like marketing. Ace sells so much merchandise. If you kill him, what are we gonna sell? Donuts? But to the point of this video, the complaint of Mr. Redditman was that Luffy doesn't suffer anymore. And if that is true, then it could present a genuine problem, as suffering isn't just something that particularly bloodthirsty readers and watchers desire, it's also being deemed a necessity by the author himself. Although it is interesting to see how things flip. When Luffy is suffering at his lowest low, the fans, they write in to beg Oda to help him out. And when he's doing just fine, in fact better than fine, he's at his highest peak, they want him to suffer. So maybe Oda was right to ignore everyone around him during the Paramount War. And look, there is a reason why we don't let fans write the manga, and Ace's death did serve as the single most prominent moment of growth for Luffy in the series to date. But that prominent moment happened in 2010, which is a long way ago now. So 15 years later, I can understand where this sort of sentiment is coming from, which isn't to say that Luffy hasn't suffered post-time skip, he certainly has. This is more of a Gear 5th specific criticism, and it stems from how Luffy handles combat post-Kaido, which is to say that Gear 5th combat, it is very easy, it's very fun, it's very clean. And when Luffy does stuff like turning Kizaru and Saint Saturn into delicious pizzas, it presents a very different tone from what we're used to in those climactic arc battles. To go back to one of the more famous bouts, round 3 of Luffy vs. Crocodile on Alabasta. By this point, Luffy had been impaled, desiccated, poisoned, and the situation was so desperate that Luffy was resorting to using his own bloods as a source of liquid to counter Crocodile's devil fruit. And on top of that, Luffy had to beat Crocodile by punching him through solid bedrock. It was a major, major struggle. And it's only because of how much Luffy has to go through that victory against Crocodile feels as good as it does. When Luffy takes a hit, we take a hit. And it creates that sense of vicarious struggle. The same principle then applies to NL. This was a much shorter fight, but to even get there, Luffy had to climb Giant Jack with this unfathomable amount of weight and gold smelted to his arm, or against Rob Lucci, where Luffy was pushed to his greatest pre-time skip physical limit against an opponent who excelled in raw physicality. And this feeling has been present in a lot of post-time skip as well. Luffy vs. Katakuri mostly speaks for itself, or at the very least, I'm not going to bother speaking for it it in this video, because I, for one, have far too many paper cuts from jerking that fight off already in other videos. And it's not purely about fights either. When I think of struggling, one of the more iconic images that does come to mind is Luffy desperately punching the Noah to pieces whilst bleeding out due to the wound that Hody gave him. Or arguably Luffy's greatest physical struggle, the climb up the Drum Rocky. You can use this one moment of Drum Island as a metaphor for the entire series. You've got Luffy climbing a freezing cold flat mountain with his bare hands, bleeding fingers, and carrying a whole human's weight on his back and the weight of another much heavier human in his mouth. This is the struggle of setting sail into the Grand Line and encountering impossible odds. You make progress, very slow progress, we're at 28 years of progress at this point, but eventually Luffy completes his journey. He gets to the top and we see this stunning castle destination, which is what it's going to be like when we finally get to Laugh Tale. A huge reward and a huge relief for deciding to take on such a great challenge. But with Gear 5th, it can feel like we've already accomplished that challenge even though we haven't. It's like Luffy's climbed about 80% of the way up the Drum Rockies, and then for the last 20%, it's not a challenge anymore. He's granted god powers and he just happily floats up like a balloon. Now, to be fair, it's only been about an arc and a half of Gear 5th now, but the current fear is that Luffy will never have to work anywhere near as hard to achieve his dream ever again. When in fact, it should be the exact opposite. The stakes and the competition are greater than ever. And there's also a certain aesthetic that's been missing ever since Gear 5th. It's that serious Luffy where Oda draws the vertical lines down his eyes, blood dripping from his face with various bruising textures everywhere. And not to sound too edgy, but we have lost Oda's fantastic use of blood in general when Luffy fights. Something that Oda really excelled at, especially in the pre-time skip One Piece era, was creating these impactful spurts of blood during combat, like this one of Luffy kicking Crocodile all the way up into the air. And Serious Luffy was always a powerful work of art by Oda, which we don't really see anymore. Although in my personal experience, what always surpassed even that was Smiling Luffy. In the worst case scenario, in the harshest of fights, seeing this smile appear always gave me as a reader a solid injection of hope. And those smiles are a very small scale version of what Gear 5th as a whole is designed to do, and a sign that this was always the direction that Oda wanted to go in. Also, this video is brought to you by a paid partnership with BetterHelp. The start of a new year can be really difficult. If you're anything like me, January, it is that chance to start fresh, and there's so much that you want to do and accomplish, but those high expectations, they start to stress you out and weigh you down. Which is why BetterHelp is here to help you feel lighter and step into the new year with clarity and self-compassion. With BetterHelp, you just fill out a thoughtful questionnaire and you will be matched with a qualified credentialed therapist to fit your needs. And if that match isn't quite right, then you can switch to another therapist at any time for any reason. Because BetterHelp is all about removing that weight and making the process of starting therapy simple and easy. You can have sessions by phone, video, or live chat, whichever is most comfortable for you, which I find amazing because, on a personal note, I'm not the kind of guy who generally asks for help, and as a result, I've spent a lot of my life unaware of the tools that therapy can offer to improve my life and get me moving more efficiently towards my goals. And in a 2024 US survey, 72% of clients reported a positive experience after 12 weeks of therapy on BetterHelp. So if you'd like to feel lighter, then click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/groundlinereview to get 10% off your first month and let BetterHelp support you in feeling lighter in 2026. So give BetterHelp a go and see if it's the right fit for you. But for now, it's back to you, me. But before we get there, Gear 5th has already arguably created an ideological disconnect. As a wise man who once ate far, far too many Oshiroko that one time once said, no one deserves to get laughed at after they die. He said that, and those words were good. Anyway, here's that same wise man laughing his ass off so hard while he's in the air with Vegapunk dying right next to him on the floor, which went on to inspire this hastily put together, how shall we call it, artwork of Luffy visiting and laughing at the graves of Whitebeard and Ace. Granted, this is more of a meme, and memes, they're jokes, but there is always some truth in jokes. Luffy, he's just not the same in this form. And I should say that Luffy did eventually react to Vegapunk on the floor, quite comically. He did the eye popping. Also, Vegapunk wasn't dead, and Luffy wasn't laughing at Vegapunk specifically. He was just laughing in general, about nothing in particular. But also, when you've got Luffy asking why Bonnie's crying, and then cutting to the shot shot of Luffy smiling whilst Bonnie is on the floor with Vegapunk bleeding out behind her, it can come off a bit weirdly, especially when you compare it to, say, the Kinemon on the roof moment. As soon as Luffy reached the rooftop, he immediately noticed Kinemon and the other vassals, and his first instinct was to do his best and King Meruem impression and walk right past two Emperors of the Sea as if they didn't even exist, so that he could go and immediately check on his friends. And it's a bit like Luffy loses his sense of awareness in Gear 5th. He's operating on that rush of pure freedom, and that, more so than anything else to me, is the difference between a pre-Gear 5th world and a post-Gear 5th series. I think that if Luffy had not been using Gear 5th at the time, then he would have immediately noticed Vegapunk instead of having that delay, and furthermore, he would have gone over to physically check on Vegapunk and comfort him, instead of just, continuing to vibe. So I see where people are coming from. As far as I go personally, I don't think I see this as a problem, at least not yet. I see it as an evolution of the character where we gain more than what we're losing. But to be fair to the original argument, I would now like to present a segment that I like to call Helpful Suggestions from Reddit. And that also happens to conclude Helpful Suggestions from Reddit, because there aren't any, there never are. But let's look at some of the unhelpful ones for fun. We've got Kill Usopp. Kill Usopp, that MF isn't doing anything anyways. Kill Usopp and replace him with Sniper King. Usopp really needs to die. I have never had the desire for a character's death in a show like I have for Usopp. He had his chance with the time skip, he wasted it. Waste him. And finally, f it, kill Robin too. So counting up the votes, that's 4 Usopps and 1 Robin. Usopp, you have been voted out of the tribal council, and I shall now present a short one-act play written by a user proposing how we would get rid of Usopp. And this starts with some stage directions. Those directions are: Akainu kills Usopp. Akainu. Gag gag. Why is he laughing like that? That's not how he laughs. Sakazuki doesn't laugh. Gag 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 gag. You're still as weak as last time, Mugiwara-san. Luffy. No, this can't happen. Individual still shots of the rest of the crew being shocked and crying. Luffy. I will not allow this. Gear death. So that Tony Award-winning writing was conjured by someone who I'm certain was just having fun. But again, there's always some truth in jokes. And I do think this serves as very effective satire for the kind of bloodlust that the small percentage of the One Piece fan base are starting to crave. But here's why craving that suffering is the wrong idea. Because Oda had 2 main missions when he was creating Gear 5th. One in-world reason and one outside of that, a meta reason. During an interview with Detective Conan author Gosho Aoyama, Oda specifically addressed Gear 5th knowing that it was an incredibly risky maneuver and that it could have resulted in a fair bit of fan backlash. Which is fair enough because it is always a gamble when you decide to give a character toon powers that occasionally break the 4th wall. But Oda said that he wanted to create Gear 5th to unburden himself as an author. He wanted the freedom to be unrestricted and more playful with his fights. And he also mentioned that the more cartoonish and imaginative origins of manga had been lost over time. That in the pursuit of leaning towards more hard-hitting realism, manga had lost a lot of its abstract creative expression. In the example that he gives is a character's legs spinning around in circles when they're moving comically fast, which is something that Gear 5th Luffy now does quite regularly. He also mentioned hating the cycle of shonen battle manga, which was that fights keep on having to get more and more serious as time goes on. Oda wanted to do the opposite. And that by the end of One Piece, Oda said that he didn't want it to be a deeply serious manga. He wants One Piece to end on a much more playful note, and that is what Gear 5th is the gateway for. It allows him to do literally anything he wants with Luffy and cram in as many gags as he can think of during what should be traditionally more serious fights like Luffy versus Kizaru. So for anyone who really wants to feel Luffy like he was pre-Kaido, I don't think we're going back to that. I mean, we might, but One Piece has turned into something different. But very importantly, that doesn't mean that One Piece as a whole follows the tonal shift experienced by Luffy. One Piece is still quite confrontingly serious at times, such as during the Kuma flashback or the recent God Valley flashback, but Oda now always has access to the relief valve that is Luffy. Other characters can and will experience tremendous pressure, but Luffy will always be there to alleviate that at just the right moment. So the suffering and bloodthirst that people are craving, it is still well and truly there. It's just that now it's being experienced by the arc-specific characters. And Luffy, who is now awakened as the Joy Boy, the Sun God, it is his role to liberate those characters. It is Luffy's mission to spread joy, laughter, and like I just said, liberation liberation. He is the hope of the oppressed, and he needs to maintain this symbology. One Piece has now become bigger than Luffy, and Oda is focusing on the idea of spreading that freedom that Luffy has achieved to others, to the whole world. Which you can see because the big climax of Egghead Island, it wasn't Luffy defeating the main antagonist like almost every other arc before it. It wasn't even the defeat of a main antagonist, period. Arguably, it wasn't even to do with Luffy. The climax of Egghead Island was Jewelry Bonnie activating her sun god form and becoming truly free. It was her liberation after experiencing her story of suffering. So we've transferred these traditional qualities from Luffy to other temporary protagonists, and I would imagine that someone like Loki, for example, is going to be another one. And look, you can explain it nicely with all of the words it is that I've just used, and it makes sense in the brain, but it may not make sense in the heart. Because how successful this strategy is depends on how personally invested you become in these characters outside of the crew. And so if you're not particularly open to Bonnie, then this isn't going to work for you. But I do think that most One Piece readers and watchers are on board with that, and they are happy to invest in this entire world of characters. But if not, then sure, it's going to feel like Luffy spending the whole arc screwing around, not taking anything seriously, being a bit of a joke protagonist. But while he is the serious protagonist, Luffy didn't really fulfill that role on Egghead or on Elbaf at the moment. Currently, he's much more of a supporting character. Although on Elbaf, we'll see how that plays out. But at the moment, Luffy's done almost nothing for the past 2 years, except almost free Loki. That could change, but right now, other Straw Hats have done significantly more. However, I do think that there is a potential for a shift during the final arc of One Piece where Luffy is fighting directly for his dream, which should mirror the pre-time skip era, because when you look back on it, physical stuff aside, Luffy didn't really mentally suffer a whole lot until the final saga of pre-time skip. That is when Luffy took L after L in all sorts of different ways, shapes, and forms. He lost his crew, he lost most of the fights he got involved with, and he lost his brother. He had hard fights all through pre-time skip, but nothing even came close to breaking him until Ace. And arcs were usually centered on other characters, your Namis, your Vivis, your Robins. Just as most of post-time skip One Piece isn't a personal story for Luffy. The emotional centers of each arc tend to be a specific character who gets designated with the suffering. Shirahoshi on Fishman Island, Trafalgar Law for Dressrosa, Sanji for Whole Cake Island, Momonosuke and the Vassals for Wano, Bonnie for Whole Cake Island, and now Loki and the Giants for Elbaf. There will come a point where this formula stops working though, and that will be during the very final phase of One Piece where Luffy isn't fighting directly on behalf of someone else. It'll be when he's facing off against probably Blackbeard to achieve his goal of becoming the Pirate King. And when this moment comes, I do find it difficult to see us getting past it without Luffy kicking into some form of serious mode. And this may also be the point where Gear 5th will either fail or be overcome, and we need a different solution against Blackbeard, who can theoretically cancel out the Sun God abilities with his darkness due to them being devil fruit generated. But as I've said many times in many videos, the final saga of One Piece so far is about Luffy leaving a legacy, because I think that's where Oda's mindset is as an author. He knows that this is the last big outing, and he wants to share Luffy's freedom with the whole world. That sharing started with Bonnie, it's probably going to continue with the Giants of Elbaf, then onwards to the dawn of the world, and in doing so, hopefully instilling the hearts and minds of every reader and watcher in the real world with that sense of freedom.